June 8, 1945. The Banka Strait, a narrow, shoal-choked, mine-infested channel between Sumatra and the island of Banka in the Dutch East Indies. A British submarine of 1,575 tons submerged displacement sits in shallow, current-swept water she was never designed to fight in, watching a Japanese heavy cruiser of nearly 16,000 tons, armed with 10 8-inch guns, and escorted by her own destroyer, steam past at 15 knots, too close to the Sumatran coast to turn away from anything fired at her. At 12:12 that afternoon, the submarine does something almost no submarine commander of the war dared to do. She fires every single torpedo in her bow tubes at once, 8 in a single salvo, at a target 4,000 yards away, the absolute limit of her torpedo's range, with nothing held in reserve if the shot goes wide. 3 minutes later, 5 of the 8 have found their mark. Within half an hour, the cruiser has broken in two and rolled onto her side, and more than 1,300 of the men aboard her are dead. It was, by tonnage, the largest Japanese warship any Royal Navy vessel sank in the entire war, and the submarine that did it carried a tenth of her target's weight. By June 1945, Japan's position in the Dutch East Indies had collapsed into isolated garrisons cut off from resupply, and the Imperial Japanese Navy's few remaining major surface units were reduced to running troops and evacuating personnel between ports the Allies had not yet cut off entirely. The heavy cruiser Ashigata, laid down in 1925 and commissioned in 1929, then extensively rebuilt through the 1930s to nearly 16,000 tons fully loaded, was no stranger to fighting the Royal Navy.
In March 1942, in the chaotic aftermath of the Battle of the Java Sea, Ashigara had combined fire with her sister ship Mayoko to help sink the British destroyer HMS Encounter, while 2 more of her sister ships finished off the crippled British cruiser HMS Exeter. By 1945, with that early Japanese dominance in the region long since reversed, Ashigata had spent much of the intervening years as a flagship before being reduced to exactly the kind of transport duty her design was never intended for. On June 7, she left Batavia, modern-day Jakarta, bound for Singapore carrying some 1,600 Japanese soldiers, escorted only by the destroyer Kamikaze. Allied codebreakers reading Japanese naval traffic through ultra-intercepts had already given Rear Admiral James Fife, the American officer coordinating submarines across the Southwest Pacific, enough warning to position a screen of Allied submarines, American and British, across her likely route. The American submarine Blueback made the first contact report as Ashigata sortied, passing the sighting on to the rest of the patrol line. Among the boats waiting on that line, positioned in the Banka Strait north of the shoal that gives the area its name, was the British submarine HMS Trenchant under Commander Arthur Heslett, with a second British boat, HMS Stygian, patrolling nearby. Heslett was already one of the most successful submarine captains of the Far East campaign, and Trenchant had spent the preceding months sinking Japanese transports, junks, and smaller warships along the coasts of Sumatra and Malaya, but nothing in her record to that point compared to the target now approaching the strait. Nothing about the tactical picture that developed on the morning of June 8 favored Trenchant.
Heslett had assumed Ashigara would take the more open channel east of the shoal, closer to Banka Island, leaving him room to close to a comfortable firing range. Instead, the cruiser threaded the narrower, shallower water on the Sumatran side, and by the time Heslett worked out her course, it was clear he could not close the range at all. He would have to fire, if he fired at all, from close to 4,000 yards, right at the maximum effective range of his torpedoes, a distance most submarine doctrine of the era considered a poor bet, since the target had ample time and room to detect the torpedoes' wakes and turn away before they arrived. Doctrine also generally favored a partial salvo, holding several torpedoes in reserve in case the first shots missed, or in case another, more valuable target appeared later in the patrol. Firing all 8 bow torpedoes in a single salvo, from extreme range, against a fast-moving cruiser that could still maneuver, was not the safe textbook shot. It was close to the only shot Heslett was going to get. What made the attempt viable at all was a mixture of geography and gunnery method, rather than any special property of the torpedoes themselves. The shoal to Ashigara's east and the Sumatran coast to her west meant that whatever else she did, she could not turn away from Trenchant without either running back toward the submarine or grounding in shallower water still. Her own escape routes had narrowed to almost nothing. Heslett's fire control team compensated for the extreme range and the uncertainty in the cruiser's exact course by aiming the 8 torpedoes not at a single point, but as a fan, spread individually across a band running from roughly a quarter of the ship's length ahead of her to a quarter of a length astern, so that even a misjudged course or a late alteration by Ashigara would still put several torpedoes across her intended path. It was a technique built to turn an unreliable single shot into several partially independent chances, and it depended entirely on Hazlitt holding his boat in position, submerged in shallow, mined water within reach of an escorting destroyer, long enough to complete the firing solution and loose all 8 fish before anyone aboard Ashigara or Kamikaze knew Trenchant was there. At 12:12 p.m., Trenchant fired her full salvo. The wakes were spotted, and Ashigara attempted to turn, but the geometry Hazlitt had counted on held. Turning meant steering further into the path of the spread rather than away from it. Roughly 3 minutes later, 5 of the 8 torpedoes struck home along her starboard side, amidships and toward her stern, the combined flooding and secondary explosions severe enough to break her back. Ashigara capsized to starboard and went down at approximately 12:37, at a position just off the Sumatran coast. The destroyer Kamikaze, assisted by small local craft, pulled 853 of the cruiser's crew from the water, including her captain and the embarked rear admiral, along with roughly 400 of the soldiers she had been carrying. More than 1,300 men, the great majority of them soldiers with no role in fighting the ship that was sinking under them, did not survive. Trenchant herself never surfaced during the attack or the withdrawal that followed. Kamikaze's attention was consumed entirely by pulling survivors from the water, and no effective counterattack against the submarine that had put them there ever developed. If a single torpedo salvo deciding a battle like this is the kind of naval story that keeps you coming back, subscribing is the easiest way to make sure you don't miss the next one. Trenchant escaped the Banka Strait undamaged, despite having spent the engagement in shallow, current-swept, mined water within range of an alert escorting destroyer, a position that offered her almost no room to dive deep or maneuver if Kamikaze had located her. Ashigara remains, by tonnage, the largest Japanese warship sunk by any Royal Navy vessel during the Second World War, a distinction that stood against submarines and surface ships covering the entire war. Commander Hazlitt was awarded a bar to the Distinguished Service Order he had already earned earlier in the war, and was personally decorated with the United States Legion of Merit by Admiral Fife at Subic Bay in the Philippines, an unusual honor for a foreign officer, reflecting how closely American and British submarine commands, sharing ultra-intelligence and a single coordinated patrol line, had worked together to make the ambush possible in the first place. Set against those decorations, the tonnage comparison alone tells most of the story. A 30-year-old cruiser design displacing nearly 16,000 tons, rebuilt and modernized through the 1930s, specifically to carry heavier armor and more guns than treaty limits technically allowed, had been broken in half and sunk by a single submarine, roughly a tenth her weight, using a tactic, the full unreserved salvo at maximum range, that most submarine officers would have called reckless if proposed in the abstract. The action of June 8, 1945 came only weeks before Japan's surrender, and it effectively ended organized Imperial Japanese Navy activity in the waters around Sumatra and the Dutch East Indies for the remainder of the war. There was, by that point, very little surface fleet left in the region to replace what Trenchant had removed, and the Japanese garrisons still holding out across the Dutch East Indies lost one of the last capital units that might conceivably have supported them. The attack became one of the most closely studied submarine actions of the war for its range and method alone, an illustration that a spread salvo, properly aimed against a target with nowhere left to run, could compensate for a firing position no textbook would have recommended. Later submarine gunnery doctrine in the Royal Navy and elsewhere drew directly on the lesson that geography, not just range and speed, could be turned into a weapon. A target boxed in by a shoal and a coastline was a target that could be hit from distances that would otherwise have been considered a wasted shot. The action is still cited in submarine histories as one of the longest-range torpedo attacks of the war to succeed against a maneuvering target, a record that owed nothing to any improvement in the torpedoes themselves. None of what happened in the Banka Strait that afternoon was decided by the numbers on a specification sheet. On paper, a 1,575-ton submarine at the outer edge of her torpedo's range, with no reserve shots and no realistic escape plan if she was found, had no business sinking an armored cruiser more than 10 times her displacement. What the specifications could not measure was a commanding officer willing to read a stretch of water as a trap rather than an obstacle, a fire control team willing to spread 8 torpedoes across a calculated band of uncertainty instead of gambling everything on a single aim point, and a crew willing to hold their position in shallow, mined water long enough to see the shot through. Ashigara's designers had built her to survive the guns and torpedoes of ships her own size. They had not accounted for a submarine a tenth her weight, cornered by her own escape routes, that fired everything she had rather than something she could afford to lose.